Our government has delivered on our promise to legalize, strictly regulate, and restrict access to cannabis.
We've put forward a process on obtaining pardons that is simplified, that will be free for people who have simple possession of cannabis.
Pardoning is not the way to go. We need to move forward with record deletions. Expungement is the way to go to truly rectify the historic injustice.
We're going to see how this unfolds, and we're going to propose changes to the regime based on the feedback that we see.
There is no question that the world is watching Canada.
It's true, the world was watching as Canada legalized cannabis, and no, the sky didn't fall. But with one big promise down, the government started on another, pot pardons. In this new era of legal pot, what is the payoff for the Liberals come next election? The At Issue Gang is here to dig into that and a whole lot more. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and joining us for the first time, also in Toronto, is Andre Demise. Good to see everybody, and thanks for joining us, Andre. I don't start with the newbie, so I'll put you on ice and let the the other two start off. Let's start with the issue of pardons, but more, Chantal, I guess, from a perspective of could that lead to political benefit down the road? If there's tens of thousands of Canadians out there who might be able to change what their criminal records look like, would there be a payoff, I guess?
Maybe so, probably from some of them, but if that were a big political calculation on the part of the Liberals, it begs the question. They've known for months, if not at least a year, when the day when cannabis was going to be legal was going to be. So how could they not come up with legislation and just promise to draft legislation? It seems to me, with all the apparatus of government, that they could have come up with a bill on Wednesday rather than an intention.
Andrew.
It does beg the question of why people have to apply, first of all, to get a pardon. I've been trying to rack my brain to think of what would be the argument against simply declaring, look, this whole experiment with prohibition was a 90-year mistake. We've admitted it was a mistake as a country. Why then would the onus be on people to apply to have that either pardoned or expunged from their record? Why wouldn't it just be a blanket pardon for anyone convicted of simple possession? There's an argument for a pardon versus expungement, which is in dealing with the U.S. authorities.
Yes.
Which is where they might have a record of your criminal conviction, and this would be a way of showing that you've been given a pardon. But beyond that, to me the question is, why is the onus placed on people who have been convicted in the past of this, when there's 500,000 people with criminal convictions, 55,000 just in, I think, the last year under the old regime? It just doesn't seem consistent with it to me.
What do you think, Andre?
I agree that going with the pardon versus the blanket expungement doesn't make any sense. Being a paranoid human being, my first thought goes, the application process to be able to get a pardon, first of all, it's going to bring up your record to the United States authorities. So if you say you want to go across the border to a cousin's wedding or your aunt's funeral, that could be a reason you get stopped at the airport. And second, you'll probably have to get a lawyer to navigate that pardon system, whereas a blanket expungement would have you avoid all of that. So if the government was proactive in arresting people and drawing them into the carceral system, then why can't the government be proactive in simply getting rid of those convictions?
So what the government would say, just to put that on the record, is that the expungement doesn't erase the records that might exist in the United States. And if you have a pardon, and I think this is what Andrew was alluding to, at least you can say to border agents, oh, this is my pardon, so this record has been erased.
But under any scenario, they could have been more proactive. This issue has been in the House of Commons, raised by the NDP for more than a year.
It has.
To just come up with an intention on the day of legalization, to me, sounds a bit strange, and I have to think that maybe they just don't have the logistical means to make it happen quickly. And they're giving themselves time to be ready for it, because what's the point of saying, as of today, we're going to issue a blanket pardon if you can't logistically achieve that?
Well, and that could be if the numbers are as high as they seem to think that they are. Yeah.
But if that's the case, they should say so.
I mean, I say this as somebody who worries about the normalization of marijuana, worries about some of the health effects. But the fact that we ever dealt with this by criminalizing people who used marijuana, I mean, maybe it was excusable in the times that we lived in the past, but now that we've acknowledged that it was just a ridiculous error, that we never should have gone down that road, it seems passing strange that we would leave people with the onus of getting that off their record individually by themselves, rather than the government, having admitted it was a mistake, taking responsibility itself.
Andre, last word on that, and then I'm going to change topic.
Well, there's another part to that, and that's that we're talking about simple possession. We're not talking about trafficking, and unfortunately, it's not there's not really an objective measure for trafficking. You can simply have had too much weed on you when you were stopped by police and then been charged with trafficking. So to say that simple possession is where we should stop, I think is a bit of a mistake. There are people that are still in the system that probably even had no intention to traffic that are still going to be left with records.
Okay, I'm going to change topics to something definitely more complicated for the entire world, I would say. And this is, of course, Saudi Arabia and how this government and how the world chooses to deal with the details around the disappearance of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. So this is what our Foreign Affairs Minister, Chrystia Freeland, had to say about that today.
Canada's position on human rights in general, very much including in Saudi Arabia, is clear and firm. We took a clear and firm position in August, and I think that is something that Canadians can be proud of.
So she said that today, but earlier this week she also said that the government wasn't going to back away from selling the light armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia, a contract that had been started under the Conservatives. Chantal, what do you make of these two messages, and is this coherent, and does it make sense in light of what the rest of the world is doing as well?
I think we are still waiting to see what the rest of the world is really doing.
Yeah,
on the
fair.
first statement, the one you aired, I do think that some of the countries who stayed silent when Saudi Arabia was coming after Canada for having tweeted that people should not be jailed without reasons and should be freed, don't look very well, and that Canada looks better for having done that in August. I also think that some of the former Canadian ministers, John Baird, not to name him, who actually went after the government for that, probably should keep a low profile on this issue going forward. The arms sales, yes, there's the matter of a signed contract, but there is, and you can't hide that fact, the matter of the jobs that are tied to it in Southern Ontario.
Andrew.
I think we have to go far beyond stern tweets in dealing with the situation, and I do think we have to look at things like the arms sales. I mean, this brings up this issue that has been bedeviling the Liberals since they came to power, where they've been defending it, saying, well, we didn't sign this contract, it was done under the old government, but the export permits to fulfill it had to be issued by this government. They are implicated, they made a decision. Now, in other times, you might say, well, Saudi Arabia is in an ugly part of the world. There, you don't get to pick your allies, et cetera. You can make some real politic arguments. But I think we're into a different territory when we're talking about extraterritorial executions of dissidents against the regime, critics against the regime. This is giving license to, it's not just Saudi Arabia we're talking about China doing this, we're talking about Russia doing this. We're in a moment here when dictators around the world are being emboldened, and they're being emboldened, frankly, in part by the response or non-response they're getting from the White House in Washington, in fact, the defense that they're getting from the president. And they're also going to be emboldened if other countries don't step up in the ways that they can. And I think this does, once again, raise the question of whether this contract should be fulfilled, and I think there'd be a strong argument against it.
Okay, Andre, your thoughts?
I think when people utter a collective groan, when somebody like Pat Robertson, who is, just a moral abomination of a human being, says that the United States shouldn't cancel contracts with the Saudis over this journalist because it's going to cost them $100 billion in arms sales. Now, we're on the same moral plane as a Pat Robertson to say that we can't cancel this contract, A, because another government instituted it, and B, because it's going to cost a couple thousand jobs in London. If the price of freedom and the price of humanity is going to be less than losing some jobs in Southern Ontario, then what are we doing?
I mean, it's interesting because they also have a piece of legislation going through the Senate that actually ramps up sort of what they have to look at in order to issue these contracts going forward. So in part, they're recognizing that this isn't sufficient. And for a government that talks a lot about Canada and how it is on the world stage, I don't know. It seems to me like there's an opening for them there.
Sure, but pardon the Liberals for having been taken to task by everyone and their sister for having dared to tweet anything, and now being taken to task for saying we're going to stay on course on this contract that we've defended. I'm not saying they should have defended it from day one, but at some point the measure of what the Canadian government should be doing has been shifting as the situation has changed. I think there is some wisdom in in this case, not taking the lead on this and waiting for those bigger countries who sat back 2 months ago to actually put some money where their mouths are.
Is that fair, Andrew, that this isn't our job to run this?
Well, it's the world community's job, let's put it that way. And that's a fair point of whether Canada can act alone or has to act in concert with other countries. But this seems to me has to be one of those red lines. It's true that realists will say we can't go around cleaning up every country's human rights record. That's, unfortunately probably true. But we can draw some red lines, i.e. not extraterritorial application of their atrocious human rights records. That is it seems to me one of those lines in the sand that the international community has an opportunity, frankly, at this point, to start drawing. And now would be a good time.
Andre?
I would say that trying to hide behind the contracts we signed, to me, it comes across as a cowardly position because the Saudis unilaterally canceled a contract to purchase agricultural goods from us, and they were expelling diplomats. So what exactly is stopping us from selling arms aside from, protectionism? I see that as an emboldening measure, and frankly, we're supposed to be better than that as Canadians.
Okay, I have 1 minute left. I'm just going to quickly flip back to pot. Will you be upset if I ask you whether you're going to purchase any now that it's legal?
I never, I don't know, I never smoked dope when I was in high school, and I didn't wait 50 years for it to be legal to start. That wasn't the reason why I didn't try.
Who else?
You want us to talk about that on national television in front
No,
of
I
the
don't
Americans
know.
who might be
I
watching?
don't know.
I
I'm
don't know about
just
that.
okay. It was up to you whether you answered. I just thought I'd go there. Chantal gets extra points for going there. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Before we go, make sure to subscribe to our podcast. This week on the podcast, we'll talk more about the cancellation of the cap-and-trade system in Ontario. Look for it on iTunes and your major podcast app. Our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.